As usual, with one of these plans videos, I'll try and get everything about the itinerary for 2026 and December of this year beforehand out of the way right here at the beginning. So anybody not interested in the remainder of the Q&A can be on their way. Now that Solar Tide is done, the fantasy will be taking a back seat for at least 4 or 5, 6 months. The Contagion cycle is going to be getting an installment hopefully in December. As I've drafted the first kind of pass at this story, it seems like this story is going to end up being a long one, so I may need more time than getting it out late December, just before the new year as I'd planned. But the plan for this Contagion story, which is a sort of prequel to Spider's Phage and the build up to it all the way back to a scratching at the door, is built off of the expedition the Burmese sort of king Anarata supposedly led up into the north to find Paunku and destroy him, hopefully. I mean, obviously it didn't work out, but that expedition, it'll be a sort of sword and sorcery story, a historical horror story set in medieval Myanmar. In the interim, if I do decide that Burma, old-school Burma story is too big to tackle in December, then I have a couple other stories that will get written at some point, even if not in December, maybe early next year if the Spider's Phage sort of Contagion cycle story comes first. But I have a Manila story that I want to tell about a creepy apartment complex that involves changelings and some other Filipino folklore. And then I have a winter story about a hike out to Courthouse Rock at Red River Gorge during a sort of snowy, lonely time of year. Later in the year, a big horror project might be a South Sea cycle novel or a novella. I don't know if that will end the South Sea cycle of stories, but I have an idea for a much longer story I want to tell in that wheelhouse. So if there's going to be, a novel this 2026, it will probably be that. In the fantasy sphere, there's still going to be some motion. The Doom That Came to Milikatlan is a story that I'm already boarding out and kind of getting ready to write, and that will be a probably long, short story, 2.5, 3 hours maybe even, depending on how the writing process goes, about what is happening to the city of Milikatlan in the fantasy setting, as referenced in Solar Tide. The Secret History of the House of Tepekishko will get at least 2 more installments over the course of this year, but they'll be pretty spaced out because, the decision to include visual elements, maps, and things like this in that series has slowed down my ability to produce them. And as I've said before in some comments and elsewhere, my intention was before Solar Tide came about to get the Secret History of the House of Tepekishko up to the 8th and 9th centuries of the imperial calendar so that the War of Venom and Fang could be covered. This did not work out. So people went into Solar Tide with no real deep background on the Elospid available to them. And the reason that delay took place is because there's a lot of centuries between the end of Episode 3 and what would probably be Episode 5 or 6, which would cover the War of Venom and Fang. So I can't just skip over all that, be like, there were a lot of kings and stuff happened and then the spiders showed up. I can't just, treat it that way. I want to give it a genuine shake, and that's what I'm going to try to do this year. The Western Kentuckian Sun is still being worked on. It's something I tend to poke into a few times a year when I need a breather from other projects, but it's still something I've talked about this for a couple years now on and off, but it's still something that's probably years away from seeing the light of day. But what I can say about it is that it's set in Appalachia, mostly in eastern Kentucky, though up and down Appalachia it has locations that probe into these areas. Sort of in the French and Indian War, Revolutionary War, and the aftermath and some of the early Indian wars on this easternmost portion of the western frontier. And it might be of interest to any of you who read It Came Down from the Hills to know that the protagonist of this story Even though it is not a horror story or a fantasy story, it has some literary elements of fatalism and things like that, but nothing explicitly weird, fiction-esque. But the protagonist from this story is a young Zachary Walker from It Came Down from the Hills, so it's him as a younger man in the 1700s. That pretty much wraps up plans for the coming year, and, hopefully, if you've enjoyed everything I've done thus far, you'll continue to enjoy these projects moving forward. Now, to get into the construction of Solar Tide before the Q&A proper, I'd like to just say that the Solar Tide was harder to do than He Who Thunders was, and I've had times, this is why the release was so stuttered, and, I had to break to do rewrites and things like this. I was really worried about the way Solar Tide was playing out, because I didn't have with He Who Thunders, I had years to sit on it and reread it, every year and a half for, 3-4 years in different incarnations, very different drafts, rewrite, etc. With Solar Tide, the entire thing has been constructed this year, and I didn't have all of this time to get emotional distance from the work and reapproach it and cut it down to size in a way that was narratively appealing to me, but in the end, I am proud of how it turned out. Having said that, though, there's a lot that got cut out of the Solar Tide, and that's what a lot of these breaks were for. Were for rewrites to the Durunk portions, especially the late book Durunk portions of the book, and cuts to the Bharani portions of the book. Bharani already has a super heavy presence in the narrative. The Lautani side of the narrative is much more weighty in terms of word count, page count, just number of minutes in an audio reading. There's way more time devoted to that than the Durunk side of the book, and this is very understandable. Durunk's side of the book, even though other people and people of importance on occasion show up in his narrative, the narrative is really about him and his internal journey. It's much more introspective, and action occurs, but really Durunk is alone in his head for a lot of what's occurring during his portions of the book, whereas Bharani is constantly in the company of others, and you're getting a much more, youthful man's, not that Durunk is an old man, but you're getting a much more youthful man's kind of engagement with conflict and upheaval in the world and these sorts of things. And I think there's value in both of those stories, but as the Solar Tide closed in on release, and then as I finally began to record it, it became evident to me that Bharani's side of the story, if I just read it as it was going to end up being like 4-1 over Durunk's side of the story. This is something that if I had a year to think about things, I might have been cropping back the entire time I built up to the release, but as it stands, I had to do a lot of this on the fly. I'm, as I say, happy with how it turned out. I think looking back on it, for what it was, it came out incredibly good. Time will tell whether or not other people think that, but I'm very happy with how it came out. But it was complex, and I think in future I'm going to be more hesitant. This isn't to say I won't do it, but I'm going to be more hesitant with doing split narratives like this. I don't know if this book would have been better off as 2 books, with one shorter novel devoted to Durunk and one longer novel devoted to Bharani, but in later climes and later points, I may think about that sort of structure for these novels in the future, rather than doing an intercut novel like this. But it was a useful experience, and I still think it came out okay. To give you an example of some things that were cut out of the Bharani side of the narrative, and some of these were fully written and polished up, and some of these were not. The later ones tended to be less edited and polished. But there were 2 chapters cut out of the garrison section, where they've kind of arrived in Sir Girkar and are waiting for the assault to occur. A lot of interactions between Bharani and the other boys from Tuju Danao. Characterization. There was a letter chapter, a letter from home, I should say, where he's reading a letter from his family back in Tuju Danao, and kind of contrasting that with the dire and dour circumstances he's in, placed along the outer wall. But then there was a much more complex and polished set of chapters, 3 chapters to be exact, right in the first act, the first part of the book, which was replaced entirely. All 3 of these chapters were condensed down to that one letter that he writes to his mother to describe the process of training. One of these chapters was very heavily focused on the training. Another chapter involved the mechanics of sneaking out, of kind of slipping training and going out to drink on the town. Again, a lot of characterization of some of the other soldiers in his little group, his unit, is being done there. And there was another portion which I was sad to get rid of, but I genuinely don't think it was necessary to the narrative at all, so it's only my own emotional attachment to it that makes me sad about it. But when I was in Ukraine in 2024, they put us in a school, a really old school, as sort of a safe house while paperwork was done and stuff like this. Later it was a government building, might as well have been an abandoned building. And I don't think it's saying too much to say any of that, but one of the guys that we had with us, and we were in tight confines that whole time, living in a sort of a camping trip sort of condition where you're in buildings that aren't abandoned but might as well be. No privacy, you're forced to spend all day and all night with all of these people all the time. And we had a younger guy with us, a Bavarian, very Catholic. I hesitate to call him a kid because obviously he is an adult in a sense, but the rest of us were like late 20s, early 30s. We had a guy there from Finland who was in his early 40s. This guy was the youngest by far of any of us. And one weekend, our Finn talked the guys that were watching out for us into renting a van for us so we could go to Lviv and go to stores in Lviv to buy equipment. Because the military is pretty stretched thin. They don't give you everything you need, so we were expected to bring our own funds and pay for some of this. And of course, we used this as an excuse to get plastered in Lviv and to hang out, rent Airbnbs and just hang out over the weekend in Lviv. And our Bavarian came with us. And he had a nightly encounter, if you will, with a woman that he met in a bar that we were in Ukraine one of these nights. I believe that was the Saturday night. And she slipped away early on the next day and, for lack of any better classification, sort of ghosted him after that. And I think he kind of read more into that encounter than was there and was taught a very harsh, cold lesson about the world. It clearly messed him up for like the whole second week that we were in close confines together. And maybe this is because of the rigid Catholicism. He's a very religious guy, very philosophically grounded in that tradition. You could argue that if that were the case, he shouldn't have been out carousing with us in Lviv, but even so, he's a 19-year-old guy. He's bound to make his mistakes. This disrupted his view of the world very clearly. It made him very insular and quiet in a way that he was not before. And I wanted to do something similar with Barani, and did in this, because I remember, that's such a unilateral experience. Anybody that's ever been in this that sort of environment knows how real that experience is. When you're in an uncertain, sort of high-danger environment, you're in an alien city, an alien country, perhaps. Very, very common to kind of, especially in the throes of youth, to kind of misread a situation and have these sorts of social disruptions and depressions arise because of that. So I wanted to contrast that with the sort of warm letters home sort of relationship that Barani is having with his family, the people that really are invested in him back home. And this got cut out because it isn't a necessary part of his narrative, but I do, to a certain extent, regret that it was cut out. So I don't know if I'm ever going to polish up and release any of this stuff in any other form, but as I say, I'm happy with how Solar Tide turned out in the end. I think it's balanced much better between the two of them now than it was originally. But because of these sorts of cuts that I always feel very bad about making narratively to these novels, in the future I may not do as many split narratives. All that to say, split narratives may be on the way out. Having said all that, I think we can get into the Q&A, but I'm going to preface the Q&A with yet another diversion. I don't say anything that I'm about to say because I'm accusing anybody of thinking any differently that's asked these questions or that listens to these stories in the fantasy setting. But I purely say them because I approach the world around me, and especially fiction, the construction of narratives and literature, with a very alien mindset to the way that most people construct or consume it in modernity. I remember years ago, Dan Carlin, the guy that ran Hardcore History, which I used to tolerate listening to, called himself a political Martian. He meant that he was a libertarian. I am an actual political and philosophical Martian, and I am as differentiated from the opinions and belief structures and world paradigms of the post-industrial world as you could get without, snatching a Sentinel Island native UFO style and dumping them into downtown London or something like this. So I say this purely so that when I answer some of these questions later down the Q&A, you understand where I'm coming from. I'm not trying to yuck anybody's yum. I'm not telling you how to enjoy fiction or what should work for you. I am telling you what my philosophy is when I construct my fiction and why it is the way that it is. So that, again, later on in the Q&A, if I say something, you know where it's coming from. The first of these three things is realism. I don't enjoy it. I don't enjoy realism in fiction at all, especially in literary fiction. My principle guiding truth is transcendent truth. A good way to illustrate this is the works of Fyodor Dostoevsky or Charles Dickens, etc. The events described and the characters therein may never have existed in a material sense. You can't visit their graves. You can't find traces of them. And yet they are, in a sense, more true than any of the people that occupied the times being written about. And the reason for this is because these stories are using and employing and communicating, most importantly, philosophy and themes and wisdom which are timeless. And 300 years from now, 800 years from now, as long as there are people that can understand the runes in which these things are inscribed, these narratives will still carry weight, because there is a transcendent philosophical truth being communicated by the narrative. I do not get caught up in my fiction with the material believability or possibility of given things. How a giant bug would breathe oxygen in our atmosphere is not important to me. And that's a silly example, perhaps, but a better example might be, I don't get caught up in the questions of operational possibility or statistical likelihoods when I am describing a story meant to convey emotion and philosophy. I think of Lord of the Rings. There's a passage, the charge on the Pelennor Fields with Theoden. I think of this passage often, and there's an MP3 that I've condensed off of YouTube videos that float around of Tolkien himself reading this passage, in his own voice. And I've listened to that MP3 is burned into my brain. Anytime I've been in a position where I think I might be in close proximity to physical danger, if I have the ability, I listen to that. If I don't have the ability, I now know whole swaths of it by heart. That memorizing, I may make mistakes here and there, but the substance of it is intact. I can... morning came, morning, a wind from the sea, and darkness was removed, and the hosts of Mordor wailed, and terror overtook them, and they fled and died, and hooves of wrath rode over them. And then all the host of Rohan burst into song, and they sang as they slew, for the joy of battle was on them, and the sound of their singing, which was fair and terrible, came even to the city. Again, individual articles of speech may be messed up in that, but I could go right from the beginning of the charge down to that. That's some Beowulf shit. My hope is that, and I'm not suggesting I am capable of this. I don't know that I have ever achieved this, but my hope is that somewhere, someday, somebody takes that level of heart in something that I've written, is emboldened and strengthened to that degree by something that I've written, and that it in so doing achieves a sort of philosophical eternity by giving extra life, lighting a fire in the chest of someone else. That's the purpose of literature so far as I see it, and that's, again, even if I'm not capable of it, what I aspire to. The second interrelated thing I'd like to say is genre fiction. I don't really read it. Science fiction I'm entirely opposed to for philosophical reasons. It's a very tangential, philosophically void genre so far as I'm aware, so I don't really draw any meaningful inspiration from it. The greats in the genre, Asimov comes to mind, Herbert comes to mind, they have never really produced anything that I think is of lasting worth. And what I mean by that is that if our era came to an end tomorrow, it would be of no relevance to anybody. Whereas if, our era came to an end tomorrow, Shakespeare would still be very relevant to anybody as long as there are human beings on the planet. As long as they still have the same mental and moral paradigms, there will still be things in there, so long as they can read, which are relevant to them. So some genres I avoid altogether. Some genres are very elemental to the human condition. Horror and fantasy may be foremost among these. This is why I work in them. But most fiction in that genre has been corrupted by the material realism of modernity, and therefore doesn't really hold a lot of appeal to me philosophically. It doesn't communicate anything of timeless, transcendent value so far as truth and philosophy is concerned. So it is rare that I read horror or fantasy fiction that is not from many decades ago. And if I do read it, then the way that I consume new authors or encounter new work is to encounter them through the lineage down or lineage upward from an author that I admire. So if I know that Lovecraft is somebody who captured some element of imagination, which I find to be valuable, then I can extrapolate from him many people who have taken influence from him, or who in turn influenced Lovecraft, who came before his time, who I can trace the lineage back to through fiction. This works in many genres and with many authors. And when I encounter a new author like this, say I encounter Michael Shea, or I encounter Patrick O'Brian, his Sea Stories, Master and Commander was adapted from one of these, then I typically will consume anything that I have available from them, biography material, letters that they've written, and then all of the work in all genres that they have written, to get a better grasp for this person. Because the strength of literature, so far as I'm concerned, is that in its ideal form, this is a one-on-one link between the author and the reader/listener. This is a very intimate mode of sort of one-sided conversation in a literal sense, but in a transcendent sense, the reader is a projector into which a reel is being fed, and they are performing a collaborative sort of creative act with an author, in consuming and giving image to, in their own mind, what is being communicated. So I like to get to know these people. I like to get to know the arc of their lives and the sorts of things that they believed and held dear. And genre fiction, fantasy and horror included, things that I very much enjoy, has lost almost all of that intimacy or real philosophical weight so far as I'm concerned. So if you ask me, are there things that influenced this book? There are, but they're pretty limited, and they're almost all old. None of them new. There are some noted exceptions to this. I'll discuss one of those at length a little bit later. But if you're asking, do I know this book, or did this influence you? Probably not. Probably not, unless it was an old school pulp fiction writer, or a literary minded man or woman from the mid 1900s. Then it's probably too recent for me to have drawn any weighty influence from it. The third and final thing I would say is that I at all cost strive to avoid wiki fiction, what I would call wiki fiction or encyclopedic fiction. Because of this attachment to narrative and the transcendent importance I place on it, I don't value stories that are told in encyclopedia format. I only engage in things like The Secret History of the House of Tepekishko when I feel I need to. I feel that culture, the details of a world playing out, the experience of emotion, all of these things are best served by being in the moment. By being on the stage, as close to on the stage as you can be. And the modern impulse of sort of giving a top-down, God view recitation of events. And even if that's a fallible recitation of events, like an in-universe scribe discussing events as they understand them, this strips a narrative of a lot of its real meteoric impact that it will have on a person. It strips a lot of the poetry and worth, so far as I'm concerned, from a narrative. So I try at all times, to, if it is possible to do so, and I'm planning not just in terms of what I need to do for an audience, but what I have time for in my life. So if I say I have 30 years to work on this setting, what do I not have time to do in that 30 years? And that's being generous. Obviously, I don't know how much time I have to work on anything. But let's say, for the sake of illustration, I have 30 years to work on this setting. What do I have time for, and what do I not have time for? Well, the things being communicated in The Secret History of the House of Tepekishko, I am almost certainly not going to have time or inclination to discuss in narrative novel format during my lifetime. So, which means hopefully they will never be touched by anybody. So therefore, as opposed to just leaving them all obscure and not touched on, I'm going to attempt to sort of lay a groundwork, in-universe, scribes groundwork, but still, for all the flaws that brings, but still a groundwork for people to understand some things about the setting as I put it to paper and audio file as it was meant to be, so far as I see it. So having said all of that, the first question was that, are there going to be more Elospid? Are we going to see more Elospid? And the third book is going to be almost entirely about the Elospid. As I said a little earlier, the doom that came to Milikatlan and later entries of The Secret History of the House of Tepekishko are going to get deep into the Elospid and discuss who they are, where they're from, what they're up to, what they've historically been up to. But the third book, which is as yet unnamed, which should come out in 2027, will return to a Sholo-Shaishan point of view and will involve a trip into the underworld, into the Underdeep, which is where the Elospid typically reside. So they will get a lot more screen time as things go on. Another question is, will there be more mythology about other kindreds, these sorts of things, as time goes on? And the answer is yes. Wherever possible, it's going to be inserted into the narratives, into core parts of these narratives. A good example of this is that this third book, this Trek into the Underdeep, will involve visitations to certain passages from Ichtak I's holy text, the Bastion of Will, which mostly is sort of meditations and monastic sort of philosophy on the leading of one's life, but also has a lot of passages in it about the 19 orders given to Ichtak I by Harakwe and these sort of great mythic tasks that he carried out before ascending to demi-godhood, chosen status of his god, if you will. So there may even be, and again, I haven't even started a first draft of this third novel yet, but there may even in this third novel be excerpts of the Bastion of Will used as chapter introductions to sort of better communicate what is being discussed and in some cases lived through again in the modern period. And this will hold true for other kindreds and other peoples as well. You know, if we get an in-depth look at a civilization, then typically I'm going to try to tell you things about how they understand the world, any differentiations they may have in philosophy from the Sholo-Shaishan or core philosophy of the setting. This is sort of the shoulder over which I am seeing most of the setting. So I like, and therefore you, the viewer, seeing the setting. So it's useful for me to try to, as much as I can in a narrative, explore those philosophical differences. So you will garner glimpses at them, and then as time allows, things like the Secret History of the House of Tepekishko will allow me to touch on these things in depth as well, even if it is a Sholo-Shaishan perspective, kind of contrasting what another group might believe against themselves, and perhaps making assumptions or assertions that aren't necessarily correct in doing so. Another is, would the end of the line of Gazorgu result at length in sort of a Lautani messiah, rising among the Lautani? Those of you who have listened to the secret history of the House of Tepekishko know that it is said that Laut alone of the first brood has not had a god-blooded sort of avatar come among her mortal kindred. The Ug did, and the kings of Ganug are descended from this king, this forever king, Darlugal, who dies in the course of the third installment, spoiler alert, of the secret history of the House of Tepekishko. If, you've gotten to the end of Solar Tide, I don't know why you would be here if you had not, but you know that lineage is ended by the end of the Solar Tide. What I will say, and I've kind of touched on this in Discord comments before, and I won't get any more explicit here than I did there, because I don't want to say exactly what's happening broadly, but I would say that if you look at this setting, which is an accurate way to look at it, as a cyclical Mesoamerican sort of great sundial of the world's motions, conception of fate and history and the doom of nations and peoples, then the second brood kindreds had their 4,000 years. The 4,000-year count of the imperial calendar has been the age of the first brood, and the current plan of the old general of Harakwe is to stop this turning of the ages, to drown, subdue, maybe even kill the gods of the second brood, who he sees as cosmic missteps and mistakes, as sort of prevention of the ordering of the world as the creator intended it, again, so far as Harakwe believes, and by doing so to sort of place the first brood kindreds and himself at the head of the table of these gods in a permanent golden age. Laut represents a bridge between the two kindreds, as does Gazorgu. These are two traitors to their kindred, so far as to their kindred among the gods, so far as the broods see it. Gazorgu to the second brood, and Laut to the first brood. The Lautani, theologically we could say, and the Ug as well, see themselves as a sort of force of balance in the world. They are less concerned with what the creator wanted and maintaining than they are with maintaining a sort of status quo in the world as it is, and allowing the kindreds to continue to exist as they have existed. This seems to be the reflection of the will of their gods, and the fact that it is a reflection of the will of their gods, and their gods being Gazorgu and Laut being so intertwined, it is very possible that, they have reserved this this intervention that these deities have available to them for an opportune moment that they believe might be useful in restoring balance to the world as it is. So theologically, the door is open for that to occur. But, which pretty much is me saying it will occur at some point. I wouldn't have laid that big a breadcrumb in Secret History of the House of Tepekishko if it was not relevant. But having said that, whether or not that happens immediately or how it occurs or what that means is anyone's guess. Another question was about the belief system of the Lautani who are fighting with Sholoshaiti, who live in the province of Eztlan. That is the Sholoshaitian name for the province. The city and province more broadly would have been called Hurabaya by the Lautani. That is the name of the clan that rules that province now. The Hurabaya kings are the local Sholoshaitian, imperial Sholoshaitian, but bloodline Lautani kings that rule Hurabaya / Eztlan. And Setiawan, the character from He Who Thunders, is of this clan, of the extended Hurabaya clan. Their philosophy, historically, and again, I'll get deeper into this over the course of the Secret History of the House of Tepekishko, but the reason why there are a core of Lautani who are fiercely loyal to the Sholoshaitian system and to the god of Sholoshaiti in Eztlan is because they represent an old cult or order or sect of Lautani believers who I guess we could call them hyper-fundamentalists or traditionalists, and believed that Laut had kind of misstepped by binding the fate of their people to the Ugg via her role in the creation of Gazorgu and her bond with him long into perpetuity. And this cult would have had its most adherents in Eztlan, the continental holdings of the Lautani on the peninsula, on the Eztlan Peninsula. And this belief system would have, this is a theocracy they live in. The Deumvirate of Lautan, the Deumvirate in question, is the high priestess of Laut and the high priest of Gazorgu. So, that caste, the priestly caste, is on top of the civilization. So it's safe to say they would not have treated this fork in the belief system very kindly, and they did not. And over the course of thousands of years, this resulted in multiple wars of attempted secession by the continental Lautani, and eventually the intervention of the Sholoshayshans, who cyclically again have gained and lost this province as part of the empire several times over the course of the past few thousand years. And again, eventually, over the course of all of this turmoil, the conversion of many of these Lautani, kindred Lautani, to the Sholoshayishan religion of Harakwe, the worship of Harakwe. It's worth noting that, as is kind of evinced by certain conversations that Seti Awan and Ichtak the Sixth have in He Who Thunders, they aren't necessarily anti-Laut. They've carried a lot of the beliefs about home and things like that into the worship of Harakwe with them, and it's safe to say that they probably have a theological bent which is not necessarily opposed to Laut's continued existence, but which believes Laut to be a sort of fallen presence that needs to be restored to order. Harakwe is the force which is capable of restoring Laut to proper order. And when Laut is brought back into the fold of the first brood, then these Harakwe worshipping Lautani, can pay homage to their maker and to Harakwe, the Lord of the Gods, in their conception, as in the Sholoshayishan conception, and in the conception of a lot of theology that goes on among first brood kindreds that are more in step with the ideology of the creator / Harakwe, the Minoans, the Volvin, etc. The belief is that Harakwe was intended to be a sort of marshal of the gods, maybe not a king of the gods, but the judge and commander, the general of the gods, the protector, the sword arm of the creator and the shield arm of the other gods. And to them, a properly ordered cosmos would be worshipping, say, Ionios, if you're a Minoan, but also paying homage to the greatest brother of Ionios, which would be Harakwe. So the Lautani adhere to a sort of wishful ideology in which one day Laut will be brought back into the fold, and until this time, they trust the true lord of the first brood, Harakwe, to kind of lead them spiritually through the ages. That's sort of their theology, and that's why there is a large group of Lautani that are loyal to the empire in Eztlan. This would hold true for other kindreds who are not necessarily unilaterally religiously loyal to Harakwe. The Kandari are a good example of this. The Kandari have a lot of mythological and theological differences with the Sholoshayishans, but there is a city, Tlaxcatlan, in the east of the empire, which hosts a great diaspora of Kandari descended from the survivors of the annihilation of Calqueum. This is discussed in Starlit and Steel and in that Stygian Sidetracks episode that I did about Robert E. Howard's Hyperborea and my Kandar. This diaspora is where people like Ruhualpa, Mirakanchi from He Who Thunders are from. I had not really established this idea when I was writing He Who Thunders, so this is something I probably could have pushed harder in He Who Thunders, but it just, it wasn't part of the conception that there was this sizable population of Kandari living there. But having said all of that, the Kandari operate in a similar way. They believe Kandarag to be a fallen deity, a corrupted deity whose purpose has been hidden from her, or who has been led away from the righteous path, and who only Harakwe can kind of pull back into order, can rein in. So they serve Harakwe in the goal of one day being able to worship a returned Kandarag and pay homage to the Lord of the Gods as they see it. Another question involved influences on some of the style of the books. I think it's worth saying that people like Cormac McCarthy and J.R.R. Tolkien had a lot of impacts on the way that I write in general. But one thing in the fantasy setting specifically that I would like to lay out, which I don't say often enough, is that one of the first things I was read as a kid by my father was R.A. Salvatore's Forgotten Realms books about Drizzt Do'Urden, the Drow. And that is not high literature. I don't think anybody would mistake it for high literature. It's very hard for me to go back and read certain parts of it now. However, and this is a big however, the guy has, despite never, as far as I can tell, having done any, real, anything martial, he's never, boxed or, wrestled in high school or whatever, he has a very good understanding of weight and impact. And he can describe a fight between people. And Robert E. Howard is the only one that I've ever seen comparable to this. But it makes sense with Howard because he's an amateur boxer. He's into, feats of strength, and it just makes sense. With Salvatore, it's harder to understand exactly where this impulse is coming from, but he has the gene that allows him to understand and communicate this quite well. He writes some of the best sword fights and violent exchanges, kind of action sequences available in fiction. His pacing, his instinct for weight, these sorts of things are absolutely phenomenal. And anybody that has not ever engaged with the work, that is into that sort of thing, even if a lot of the rest of the work is frankly pretty shoddy, would I think benefit just in terms of raw entertainment from having had this stuff described to you by Salvatore. Even when Salvatore is describing, I'm reminded in Homeland, he describes, I think, a double cross down is what he calls it, this move to trap Zaknafein's sword under Drizd's two scimitars, and Drizzt kicks up between the downward swords and hits Zaknafein in the nose, and it's very hard functionally to imagine anybody pulling that off in the real world. It's not a very believable move, but again, realism isn't the thing. It's the communication, it's the art of it, and he makes you believe that it is possible. He describes it, the weight and the flow of motion, in such a way that these things seem possible. Very artful, which is a strange thing to say. As I say, I've come to be very ambivalent towards Salvatore and a lot of the things he says and does, but if he did not influence the way that I write action sequences, I don't know what did. Starting on that, probably shouldn't have been reading them that young, but that almost certainly has had a very deep impact on the way that I portray altercations, chases, fights, any of these sorts of things. Now, one email, very long one, and I appreciate it. It was a in-depth one, is mostly concerned with the sort of overarching strategy, the campaign strategy, and certain questions of battlefield tactics and applicability related to what's unfolding over the course of Solar Tide. So I'm going to answer this broadly first, and then hit different points as I go down through the line. A lot of these questions are about, how armaments, air superiority, these sorts of things are being utilized by the Sholoshayishans, how defenses are being utilized by the Ugg, etc. So I'm going to say up front that this is, I think everybody would realize to one degree or another that this is a sort of World War I inspired period of history that's playing out, maybe slightly before, but in some cases some fields of endeavor slightly after in terms of technological development, but still inspired by that 1900 to 1920 sort of time period. In this time period, these conflicts like the Russo-Japanese War or World War I, obviously, people are employing these armaments, like, say, a Zeppelin or air superiority, for the first time in conjunction with, these benefits they have, like having superiority over the air, for the first time in conjunction with other tools, other weaponry, other modes of attack. And quite often, this is not used to the degree of efficiency that we would expect it would be used, coming at it from an angle of having fought many wars with all of these different technologies and thought processes based off the use of these technologies available to us. So it's safe to say that, as far as a lot of these questions go, that plays a role. Everybody using these, including the Sholoshayishans, who has built or is overlord of nations that have built a lot of these things, is using them in conjunction with one another for the first time. And there really is no precedent for their use on this scale. Moreover, much as things like a telegraph or a radio, we would think, theoretically, in our safe modern era, must have improved communications, in many cases, the explosion of battle onto fronts that were hundreds, if not thousands of miles wide in the First World War and the Second, often confused battlefield decision-making far more than radio remedied the confusion of battlefield decision-making. There's not much radio can do to help you if it's Operation Barbarossa and your front line is all of Eastern Europe. You're going to need to have the ability to flexibly decide what's being done at a battlefield tactical level locally on the ground. Some colonel or lieutenant or whatever, way down the line from whoever's making the bigger decisions way up the line, is going to need to decide what needs to be done about a bridge when you come to a bridge and it's been blown up, or what to do about a town. If there's resistance in the town, snipers, maybe civilian, partisans, etc., up in the loft of a barn, pecking people off as you go down a road. Those decisions are going to be made snap. They may have guidance broadly about what's being done, but this is a continental war. Maybe not a continental war, but you know what I mean. This is a hundreds of miles front for most of the advance. And even once they're in Surgirkar, they're in a dense ancient city that's 50 miles wide, with no easy way to communicate with one another, unit to unit, beyond runners once they're in. So a lot of these questions, as I say, are tied up the obscurity of battle. I think a lot of the problem with thinking of battle in these clarified terms is part of this sort of Wikipediaization of not just fiction but history in general. But on the ground, in the thick of it, a lot of this stuff has no relevance. If somebody decided way up the chain that it would be more beneficial to make a certain play, that it would incur less losses to assault in this way, things are going to unfold on the ground that undermine these decisions at a command level. And local officers, which is to say officers localized to a given tactical situation, are going to need to make a call as to how they adapt to that situation as it unfolds. Also, cultural factors play into this, but we'll get into some of these questions, but we'll get into that later. So having said all that, the higher-end tactical and logistical picture from both sides is sort of communicated in the narrative insofar as I want to discuss it. This is a story about individuals adrift in this broader series of actions. But it is based in many cases on real World War I and to a certain degree earlier and later campaigns. And I'll get into that a little bit later with some of the other questions. But as for the dead general's battle plan, I assume this is Legate Ishpehualtia. Legate Ishpehualtia is legate of the 1st Ektal Legion of Tepeklan, which has 19 legions of the Ektal. The Ektal are the standing armies of the provinces of the Sholoshayishan Empire. They're sort of nobility. As close to nobility as Sholoshaydi has, if you're not, a king or a prince or a princess or what have you directly responsible for the rule of a city. The Ektal are sort of your elite caste in society. They're your professional soldiers, and they are answerable directly to the monarch that rules their city. In the case of the Ektal from Tepeklan, they're answerable to the king of Tepeklan and Tlatoani of the Sholoshayishan Empire, the speaker of Harakwe, the dynasty of Ichtak I, in this case, Ichtak VI. Now, Ichtak VI makes Ishpehualtia legate of the 1st Ektal Legion because he has to go away, and he does this under the assumption that Ishpehualtia is going to be effectively like a war dog, The Ektal are breachers. They're Sturmgrenadiers, if you want to think of them that way. They're assault troops. They're going to be sent into the most dangerous positions to incur the most losses. They are the most hardened, the most ready to incur these sorts of losses, and had Ichtak VI not needed to leave during that first interlude, he would have been doing the role that Ishpehualtia is doing. Ishpehualtia would have been under him, would have been one of the men under his command. So Ishpehualtia didn't really have a grand battle plan. His job was to storm breaches and to respond to situations on the ground. Sometimes this is good. He's making good decisions, and sometimes, arguably, like at the end when he is killed, he's tunnel visioning because he thinks I can personally kill in a very glorious, sort of transcendent, Homeric way the king of Ganug. So he's too tunnel visioned on this goal to actually be present in the moment and maybe worry about direct threats to him. So the commander of the overall campaign throughout all of it is High Marshal Tlaloc, and even he, and I'll get into this a little bit down the line, is having to adapt a lot of what he's doing on the fly because of situations back home, and because Ruhualpa Mirakanchi, the previous High Marshal who died in the events of He Who Thunders, who laid down this northern war plan to conquer Ganug and then swing south to deal with the Lautani, is dead. So, he doesn't have this old genius for logistics and maneuver available to him to kind of make these continental calls. So, and I think to go back to the question about the higher-end tactical and logistical picture, I don't think I really want to dive into this, not just because I don't want to provide the Wikipedia minutiae of it, because those things can be interesting, and I'm not decrying that. But it also drives home that High Marshal Tlaloc feels like he's out of his league. And largely the campaign is won because Sholo Shaiti has an excellent war machine. Not necessarily because... Now, Tlaloc isn't a fool. He's not worthless. He's not doing anything stupid. He does what he feels he needs to in the context of command of that scale. But it's a big battlefield. It's a country-wide battlefield, and he can lose control of what's happening on it. And he knows that, and he feels adrift. The second interlude is all him kind of questioning whether he's worthy of being where he is in the position that he's in. And I think not having access to all of this information makes you feel a little like he would. It gives you a lack of confidence about what's occurring, a lack of overhead notions of what's happening. And the same could be said of the Lautani and the Ug in their situation. Now, I would say that you say the Sholo Shaitians seem to be cannon fodder, willing to pay the blood price. I mean, they're definitely willing to pay the blood price, but I wouldn't necessarily describe the Sholo Shaitians as cannon fodder. There's no group of human beings on Earth, no organization, no country, no culture that, given these tools, could have done a better job than they did overall. Like, obviously, mistakes are going to be made, but that would be true of them as well. They're not... It was a doomed, foregone conclusion that a lot of people would be lost assaulting the city that they did as early as they did it. The purpose of the fourth interlude was to communicate that Tlaloc, High Marshal Tlaloc, believed, and is probably right to have believed, frankly, that the Empire would be best served by ending the conflict immediately. His implication that he was originally told, and this is said in the other interludes as well. I think Ichtak VI tells him when he's departing that Harakwe needs Sir Girkar by autumn. That's his war plan. The god has communicated to his speaker that is what is to be done. By autumn, Sir Girkar must be captured. It's if we're going to say Yaoyot is when they walk into the city and it is officially the banners are hung over Sir Girkar, it's our June by the time the city is captured. The assault is launched many months early, and this is why the king of Teotihuacan has this back and forth with High Marshal Tlaloc in the Temple of the Sun in Sir Girkar's, because this was not the intended plan. The plan was to stay outside of Sir Girkar for months and pound the entire city into a fine fucking rubble, and then come in after everybody is shaken to hell and back. Every ounce of ability to counterfire or fight back in the air, etc., has been annihilated, then you come into the city and kind of clear out the rats. That was the plan. That obviously was not available to them. The Ilospid, ostensibly, are causing problems in the south. Milikatlan is gone. This is a city of millions of people that is just gone, so far as the Sholoshaitions outside of that city are aware. No one knows what's happening. The Tlatoani, even though everybody assumes, he's out taking care of business, nobody knows what he's up to, where he's gone. So Tlaloc makes the crushing decision to launch this assault the second it's feasible, knowing that it's going to cost many, many, many more lives than it would have cost had he actually, employed the strategy laid out for him by Ruhualpa. And it does. It costs many more lives. But as I say, I wouldn't necessarily describe them as cannon fodder. They're not joyfully sending anybody to die. That's not a part of the ethos there. And it's only in the overarching situation of dire necessity and tragic need that they make the commitment that they do to storm the city at all. As for willing to pay the blood price, and this ties into the next question about why didn't they stop feeding bodies into the canal. They would have to send runners miles back down the tunnel to stop feeding bodies into the canal once the assault is in motion. It would be hard to kind of tell everybody, the thousands and thousands of people that are working their way up that causeway to come into the canal that's just been blown open, to stop or turn back in any meaningful way. Once you've committed, they're going to go in. And second, they've obviously been given that order, as I say in the chapter, under the assumption that by this time the city's going to be tied down internally. There's going to be people coming up all over the place through cellars and underground silos and, through the walls, through other breaches, the Kandari coming through the eastern breaches, etc. So the assumption is on the part of command that they're going to arrive in this very inopportune place, the bottom of the drained canal, and not be directly threatened. There will be too much chaos in the city to allow people to build a concerted response to them. Obviously, this isn't how it works out. But in the end of the day, they're never given an order to stop going into the canal, and this helps pin down the people that slaughter them in the canal long enough that, say, the Kandari can sweep the streets and slaughter most of these people within an hour of their arrival in the canal. So we could argue that, that's not a worthwhile investment to make, but had the Sholoshaitions not made it, then the people like the Kandari and the legions coming after them in their wake would have been caught up in the eastern portions of the lower city, and just like the legions pushing through into the western upper city were by the Lautani, and then they would have taken their losses in the street-to-street fighting over there. So there's really not a way to get around. You can't just make a clean RTS strategy as to how this is going to play out. And a good real-world analog for this would be the Battle of the Frontiers in the First World War. And a good in-universe analog to this that's a little more clear than the missteps and local sort of chaos playing out in Sirgirkar is the attack on the second wall. When the attack on the second wall happens, it happens because of a success. It's far more costly than anything was planned to be. Again, like with Sirgirkar, they probably should have bombarded it for much longer. They should have gassed it beforehand to drive people up out of hiding in the low points in the rubble. But they didn't do any of this, and the reason for that is because the southernmost breach, the Ug that had come through that portion of the wall, are totally overrun down there. And this Lautani Ektal Legion from down in Estlan takes the wall, like in a rush of they've slaughtered or captured, and probably really slaughtered given the high-paced, in-the-dark notion of they probably aren't taking the time to imprison any of these people. They've probably just slaughtered many thousands of Ug out in the fields. The wall is vastly depleted of its garrison now, and in the heat of the moment, again, on the battlefield, unable to just wire back. They don't have a walkie-talkie on them to call back home. They think, now's the time. It's quiet, it's dark on the wall. We may take some hits, but we're going to take the wall. And they take the wall, and when word gets back that they've actually captured the southern breach, High Marshal Tlaloc has to say, all right, I guess everybody's gone. We've taken the southern breach. We can't just hold that one breach. We're going to have to take the whole wall right now, whatever the case may be. And Battle of the Frontiers in the First World War, there's all kinds of examples of this First and Second World War, but and obviously the Battle of the Frontiers is a French assault and they lose. So maybe it's not a perfect analogy, but constantly you will see locally somebody kind of get carried away because they perceive battlefield conditions to be very different than they would be if they had a God's eye view of how things are playing out, and then suddenly they've cost the lives of many, many thousands of Frenchmen or Belgians or what have you, because they overinvested on the back of an assumption. So that can go, in the case of Sholo Shahidi, it worked out, but like these sorts of things are just baked into the way combat unfolds. It's hard to get around this sort of thing. And as for our Sun Tzu quote, they don't, as I say, they don't really have a choice in this regard. They either take it or they stay there for months. Their goal is to wipe the Ugg off of Haraklan and thereby kill Gazorgu, who is a direct threat to the continued existence of the First Brood in the eyes of the First Brood. So they're going to have to deal with the Ugg eventually anyway. I mean, the whole purpose of the war that's about to happen is so that the First Brood can be made permanently safe. And, some of the irony of this is, as I say, Gazorgu and Laut are sort of forces of balance between the broods, so the annihilationist influences that the Second Brood and the First Brood have towards one another are, in a sense, balanced by this pair of deities that bridges the two broods. But it's safe to say that, both of these broods have annihilationist inclinations towards one another, and the Ugg are second brood kindred. So whether they did it here or on the coast out west past the wastes, they would have had to corner them eventually. There's really no getting around cornering them and forcing them into a final battle, because the whole goal of the campaign is to kind of bring them to a final battle. And as for combined arms tactics, the narrative fleshes this out, I think, as much as I'm willing to flesh it out. There are issues with combined arms tactics, even if sides are using them in a way that we would consider kind of valuable in modernity. The Zeppelins and planes of Sholo Shahidi and the planes of the Duumvirate of Lautan, using planes, air power to coordinate artillery strikes or counterattacks or what have you. These are all relevant to real-world outgrowths, these sorts of things. But as with anything, as I was saying earlier, a lot of these factions are all of these factions are using these sorts of things in conjunction for the first time on this scale. And B, there's a lot of religious belief and overarching cultural assumptions that are here as well. The Ugg have trusted in the lines, in the walls, to defend them for thousands of years. And while they had plenty of defenses and prep time, there's really no avoiding that Gunug is the Ottoman Empire of this setting. It's a very old, very decayed civilization, and it trusted on these barriers to do jobs that they were not capable of doing. They are great fortresses, and I don't mean to imply by their defeat in this narrative is not a statement of Ugg weakness, but of Sholo Shahitian strength. It's an illustration of the fact that they're up against a global empire that outnumbers them many, many dozens of times over, and has resources that could absolutely drown them. So it's not necessarily a statement of their weakness or anything like that. It's just the situation geopolitically and on the ground, battlefield to battlefield, being what it is, the ebb and flow of these tides doing what they do. There were illustrations of how these sorts of attempts at combined arms would prove problematic. For example, I had the Sholo Shahitians shooting down one of their Volvine Zeppelins mid-battle at one point with their own artillery because the Zeppelin had gotten too close to the city. But the city fight portions of the book are already so dense and chaotic that describing, after that initial description of the Sholo Shaishin assault on the wall, I tried to be as condensed as possible. Just so they're supposed to be chaotic. They're supposed to give you a feel of how reading an Ernst Junger memoir or a Eugene Sledge memoir or Devil in the Drum or Eye Deep in Hell or Gunter Korczak or any of these people, like reading a wartime memoir, they're supposed to give you a glimpse of that level of chaos, but glimpses of violence that I've had personally, even if nothing that I've ever experienced approximates being in a Stalingrad level, like apocalyptic conflict zone like this, a Battle of Verdun level bloodbath like this. I tried to communicate that, but you can't communicate that properly and then break in the middle of it to be like, and 2 miles outside the city, a friendly fire incident with artillery occurred. So there are limits to what you can do with this sort of thing, but it's safe to say that both of these sides are running into problems with the employment of all of these different technologies, maybe gassing their own men. Like any of these sorts of things, the poor communications and the inability to disengage easily units that have engaged in inopportune ways is going to cause all kinds of problems with things like combined arms and trying to use things in conjunction with one another.